All right, awesome. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. It's Deborah Hughes with the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House. Deborah is a president and CEO in the National Susan B. Anthony House of Rochester, New York. During her tenure as president since 2007, the Anthony Museum has completed a major phase of restoration, secured its absolute charter as a museum, and dramatically grown attendance while staying true to its mission and vision. Hughes has spearheaded innovative programming and events such as award-winning Votilla, a week-long event at which you have to tell us about, Deborah, a week-long event featuring scholars and reenactors who traveled in packet boats on the canal from Seneca Falls to Rochester from New York State's suffrage centennial. As a part of celebrating 2020 on a national scale, Hughes and two other representatives from the Anthony Museum marched with the Pasadena 2020 float in the Tournament of Roses parade on January 1st, 2020, obviously pre-COVID when we still had a parade. So Deborah, I will open up the floor to you. And again, I would ask those who are joining us today to please throw your questions into the chat so we can be ready to ask her. So Deborah, you have about 5-6 minutes, and I will give you a 1-minute warning if it's getting a little too long.
Thank you so much, Dina. I really appreciate the opportunity to be speaking with people. I put behind me an image of the front parlor at the Susan B. Anthony House. This is the room in which Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting after having exercised the right that she believed she had in 1872. And of course, she went to trial for that and was found guilty of being a woman and daring to present herself to vote. And as some of you know, our current president thought it would be a good thing to pardon her for that just a few weeks ago, something which Susan B. Anthony did not want and would absolutely have refused. The reason that she didn't want that is because she truly believed that everyone should have the right to vote, and she didn't want to be forgiven for something that she should have had all along. She also understood that the trial that she had was a miscarriage of justice. The jury, who were all men and so weren't really her peers, didn't even have a chance to vote about whether she was guilty or innocent. The judge just dismissed them. When I think about the history of our voting rights movement, of course, often Susan B. Anthony pops into people's minds. She's one of the best known names. She and Queen Victoria were the two best known women in 1900 around the world. But Susan B. Anthony would have been one of the first to say to us that it's really not about the icons. It's not about the leaders you know. It's not about the voices that you've heard. It's not those people who get lifted up. That truly social change is about the people whose names you don't know, whose work you have never heard about, whose passion is about their local communities and their families and local people. And when people say, why should I vote? To me, the most important thing to remember is that the vote is never the end. The vote is always the means. When Susan B. Anthony and other advocates for voting rights would approach different groups, they would ask them, what is your passion about? What is the injustice you see? What is the pain and suffering that you are aware of? What is the hope that you have for your community or for your nation? Or what are the abhorrent things that you are seeing being done with your tax dollars that you would like to stop? Well, the way to address that is by exercising the right to vote. I think it's very fair to say that the most powerful weapon in our democracy is the vote. And we have to acknowledge that the vote can be used to oppress and control. That is why we have really fought long and hard to give people the right to get to the ballot box. If it weren't a great threat to give women like Susan B. Anthony or Ida B. Wells Barnett the right to vote, then why would it have taken generations to make it happen? And even after we passed the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote in the 19th century, why did it take another 100 years before Congress was willing to stand up to states that were violating that constitutional amendment and say through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you must not prevent people from exercising that right to vote? When we don't vote, it empowers the people who currently have control. When we do vote, not only can it be used as a powerful weapon, but it can be used to awaken, it can be used to disarm structures that are oppressive, and it can be the tool to set a direction where we can rebuild for our country. When I was thinking about voting history, I actually jumped out of the 19th century after thinking about how many times one vote made a difference. Harry T. Byrne, the Tennessee legislator who actually voted to pass the 19th Amendment, that one vote that took it off the floor of the Senate in Tennessee and assured that we would have the 19th Amendment. I jumped to Jim Alisi, a New York State Senator, who in 2011 agreed to vote to support New York State's Marriage Equality Act, freeing the Lieutenant Governor to vote to pass that legislation that provided me and my wife the ability to marry in the state of New York. But I also thought about martyrs and people who have given up their very lives for voting. Reverend George Lee in 1955. Now, I'm not quite old enough to have been born in 1955, but that's awfully close to my lifetime. He was one of the first Black people who was able to register and vote in Humphreys County in Mississippi. He was a preacher, and officials called him out and said he should stop his voter registration efforts. He refused because he understood that the vote was the most powerful instrument for change. And Lee was murdered for encouraging other people to register and vote. In 1964, in my lifetime, we know of other martyrs. It's James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwimmer, the names of the three civil rights martyrs who were killed in Mississippi on June 21st of 1964. Their deaths and the violence inflicted on civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, played a huge role in galvanizing Congress's willingness to finally pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But we know in the last few years that legislation has been weakened. So why is it important to vote? I can't think of anything more important that we could do. But let's make it a little bit closer to home for some of you. Because people sometimes think that the presidential election is the most important one, and it's probably, well, this year.
I was about to ask you that. What do you say to people who say, my vote doesn't count in a presidential election, so therefore why vote?
So let me talk about 2020 in the United States of America. In most of our communities, it's your mayor or your county legislature that determines who is the head of your police force, who determines what policies or what procedures happen, what's tolerated, what kinds of things the police will do, how they will be militarized, or how they will respond to human crisis. I live in Rochester, New York, and we've been dealing with the death of Daniel Prude. And we're dealing with the reality that police officers were trained to do something that was absolutely horrific. Well, I can make a change because I vote for the people who determine who heads up my police force. I vote for the people who determine what kinds of education we're offering, what kind of services are there. On a county level, I vote for who gets Medicaid and how much childcare is available. I vote for where food stamps are distributed and what kinds of access to food or housing people might have. On a state level, it impacts benefits for seniors, what kind of higher education is available, and how much is it going to cost in my state. On the federal level, I elect people who decide whether a president gets impeached or whether Congress is going to take action when we don't have the separation of powers. And very importantly, I determine who's going to have the hearings over people who are appointed to federal judgeships and to the Supreme Court of the land. Okay. Every time I vote on a local or a county or a state or a federal level, I have that opportunity to say my vote matters because there are things that I want to see change. Mm-hmm. And my money is funding the things I don't want to see happen. The only way for me to change that in our democracy is for me to show up and vote.
Let me just highlight that our money is funding the things we don't want to see happen.
Our money is funding the militarization of our police. Our money is funding schools where we have police officers in being security officers instead of counselors, where we have students who need food and education and care. Our money is funding the things that some are protesting about. I have to own that for those things, I have to own my participation that Breonna Taylor's killers are not going to stand trial. I participate in that because I elect the people who pass the laws and set the limits on what police and states can do. Yeah. I have to be a part of that on every single level. Susan B. Anthony would have said, if there's any issue that you think is important, you have to have a voice and you have to have a vote. And it is the vote that is the most powerful instrument for change. Ruth Bader Ginsburg made her comment that in her lifetime she'd seen so much change. Now I'll quote, "Yes, there are things that make us all worried, but I'm hopeful there'll be leaders on both sides of the aisle who will say it's time to get together and work for the good of the country." And yeah. Ginsburg goes on, "That's my hope, and I'd be content if I would see it happen in my lifetime." Our vote will determine what kind of character the people who go to serve us in government have. There could not be a more critical time than to exercise our vote.
Thank you so much, Deborah. As someone who's been involved politically for over 18 years, that message landed for me so hard right now, and in a real, in a very different way. So thank you for saying that and everything you shared.